The Cambridge Platonists, another movement before we get to John Locke, a little commercial break here. So with the Cambridge Platonists, they were a group of Anglican clergymen. Remember, Anglicans were the Church of England, the national Church of England, subject to the King of England. They were at the University of Cambridge. They were Platonists, which simply meant that they looked at the world through Platonist lenses. And the Platonists had this spiritual, religious interpretation of the world where the demiurge sort of overflowed in goodness and created all these other things of goodness in descending order of goodness. And our challenge is simply to get back to good with a capital G, which is God in our tradition. So they were opposed to the materialistic, instead focusing on the spiritual. And they were opposed to the materialistic and atheistic currents of Hobbes and Descartes. Instead, they wanted to show why it is that Christianity is true. That was their focus. Let's go back to the basics, back to Plato, and back to these other humanist sources to see how it is that Christianity really is true. They objected to insistence on obscure doctrines. Ooh, this sounds familiar from our reading of Hobbes already. Okay, Hobbes tried to do away with things that people couldn't understand, like obscure words like consubstantial. Right? Our friends, the Cambridge Platonists, would have said the same. Let's do away with obscure doctrines. They were very tolerant, which is why they were often called the latitudinarians. How's that for a word? Latitude, when we're studying geography, latitude and they were pretty expansive in who they would accept. The moral and Christian life should be more important than any doctrinal or institutional dispute. Remember this back in the time when Catholics were arguing with Lutherans, were arguing with Calvinists, etc. Wait a minute. Shouldn't our living a Christian life, loving one another, living in peace, forgiving one another, be more important than anything that separates us? They believed in the power of human reason to attain objective truth about God. That's a heavy statement, meaning we can rely on our reason, rationalism, to discover universal objective truths about God, things that all of us can agree on. All 7 billion of us on this earth can agree on certain things about God based on the way that we reason. That was quite a claim. And they also believed in the power of human reason to give insight into universal moral law, the way that we should act, things that we should do or shouldn't do. We can rationally think through these things. Some of the principal figures among the Cambridge Platonists were Ralph Cudworth. Cudworth said that Descartes' argument for God's existence involves us in a skepticism from which we can never escape. So on the one hand, we're grateful that Descartes said that, yes, I didn't create myself, I must have been created by something, let's call that something God. Okay? We're glad. But you know what? Descartes was so skeptical that how can you would just naturally question everything. He encouraged you to question everything, which is why philosophers would question even those assertions. So he would say, proof of God is impossible if we can't be sure of anything, even our own reason, and so we've got to be able to believe in the power of our own reason. He also said, the likes of Descartes, with his mechanistic worldview, had an undiscerned tang of the mechanic atheism hanging about them. If you believe in materialism and a mechanical universe, got to be careful, because the next step is that this world could run on its own without God. That's the essential question. Is God like a clockmaker who simply built the clock and wound it up and now is letting it run? Or is God someone who can step in when you pray to God tonight? How's that for a deep question? Henry Moore is the other Cambridge Platonist who said that Descartes' intellectualism, his living in his head, is repugnant, and that Cartesian philosophy, rationalism, is the enemy to religious belief. Because religious belief in the end is not going to make total sense. It's not going to be totally rational. There's certain things about religion that can't be explained through reason. But interestingly, we've talked about these Cambridge Platonists. because the Cambridge Platonists were devoted to Platonic and Christian humanism, going back to the past, Plato, they didn't become as famous as they could have been. If they had tried a more forward-looking synthesis, like some of the people we talked about, like Descartes, like Hobbes, Hume, Locke, some of these people who are creating new ideas, had they done that, we would have been studying them more during this course than we are. Instead, all they were doing is taking the past and talking about the past. They weren't creating anything new. Nothing new.